Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We're thrilled to have you all joining us today for this event. We have about 500 people registered, and we are going to be recording this webinar. My name is Jan Maru. I'm the Acting Agriculture Team Lead in the Office of Technical and Program Quality at BHA. I'm going to be your moderator today. Before we begin, I wanted to share some background on why we saw a need for standards for supporting agricultural livelihoods in emergencies, which we're calling SEADS, S-E-A-D-S. For approximately 2 billion people, small farm agriculture is the cornerstone of food security. However, these people's lives and livelihoods are constantly at risk due to emergencies. Alarmingly, evidence suggests the incidence and severity of crises is increasing, as is overall spending on humanitarian assistance. In the last 10 years, humanitarian spending increased by about 130%, and approximately 40% of this increase was a response to needs in the food and agricultural subsectors. In fact, Legacy OFTA, which is funding the SEADS project, agriculture accounted for 10% of the budget. And for us here at USAID, this was too big to be ignored. It raised questions for us, such as what is the state of the art? Are the guidelines that donors, implementers, and other stakeholders using for their interventions just pulled from thin air? What are they based on? Why are there no standards? We know that practitioners and researchers have a wealth of experience about approaches for agricultural assistance that are effective in emergencies. However, when we decided to invest in SEADS, this experience and evidence had not yet been systematically cataloged and reviewed to determine good practices across diverse contexts. Agriculture was lagging behind other sectors in terms of humanitarian standards. For example, SPHERE has become the globally accepted set of standards due to a mix of a broad collaborative process, an independent identity, organizational focus on standards and quality, and striking the right balance between evidence, technical uncertainties, and practitioner experience. However, the SPHERE Handbook contains only light guidance related to agricultural production and how interventions should be undertaken in emergencies. Other standards, such as LEGS, the Livestock Emergency Guidelines and Standards, have filled these gaps to provide more specific guidance for specific subsectors, such as livestock. By investing in these SEAD standards, USAID is attempting to elevate agriculture and the important role it plays in recovery. We need a way to ensure that agriculture projects and emergencies lead to clear livelihood impacts, are cost-effective, and promote post-crisis recovery of agricultural production, systems, and markets. When well-designed and implemented, such projects are a very cost-effective alternative and/or complement to food assistance or livelihoods recovery programs. SEADS is following a similar collaborative process to SPHERE and LEGS, to provide practitioners and policymakers a more robust set of tools for ag interventions in emergencies. Today, we will learn more about SEADS and have a discussion about the state of evidence for agricultural interventions in emergencies. I would also like to acknowledge the quality of work that you all, our partners, do, and the challenging environments you work in every day, and see this as a chance for us all to come together and rally to elevate agriculture in humanitarian practice. The event will flow as follows. First, Racy Henderson, the SEADS Coordinator, will give a brief presentation of the findings from a recent learning brief done by the SEADS project that describes their experience reviewing the evidence on the impact that emergency agricultural interventions have on people's livelihoods. Then we will have a discussion with 3 experts, looking at some important questions about the state of evidence on the impact that emergency agriculture interventions have on people's livelihoods. For this, I'm joined by Juliette Parker, Deputy Director at ALNAP, Temba Sibanda, Cash and Livelihood Specialist from Norwegian Refugee Council in Iraq and SEADS Steering Group member, Howard Standen, Climate and Food Security Advisor in the Research and Evidence Division at the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Then we will open the floor to Q&A. I'm certain there are a lot of good questions for our speakers. Kathy Watson, the LEGS, Livestock Emergency Guidelines and Standards Coordinator and SEADS Steering Group member, will jump in at this point to help moderate the questions. Finally, to wrap up, Racy will tell us about how SEADS is engaging with the evidence and filling evidence gaps to develop a handbook that will be useful. Today's webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes and we will be on time. Before we get into the meeting, let me ask you to use the Zoom tools in a specific way. Please use the chat icon at the bottom of your screen if you need to be in touch with the organizers. Please use the Q&A to submit questions for the speakers. You may submit questions as you have them. Kathy will be organizing them as they come through. And as I noted, we are recording this event and it will be available on the website afterwards, as will the reports. Now I'm going to turn it over to Racy. Racy?
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Jan. I'm talking to you today from a beautiful, sunny upstate New York, and really pleased to see everyone, or at least know that everyone is here with us to learn about SEADS today. So I'm going to briefly introduce you to the SEADS project and our progress to date. Then I will share the results of our evidence review and our takeaways from that exercise. And finally, as Jan said, at the end, after the panel discussion, I'll come back on to share next steps on how SEADS will address the gaps in evidence. So first, an overview of SEADS. The SEADS project is an inclusive and consultative process to develop evidence-based standards for supporting agricultural livelihoods in emergencies around the world. With your help, the SEADS standards will enable those responding to humanitarian crisis to design, implement, and evaluate agriculture interventions to maintain and strengthen the livelihoods of farming communities, support preparedness and post-emergency recovery, and increase their resiliency. SEADS is designed to benefit people who rely on agriculture for their livelihoods and are subject to emergencies that threaten those livelihoods. We are committed to understanding and including local perspectives while recognizing the wealth of experience in the international humanitarian community. We take a livelihoods approach to ensuring that responses to emergencies are implemented in a way that facilitates long-term recovery and growth. The handbook will promote ways to support systems and services during emergencies that are needed to enable post-disaster recovery. SEADS is a forward-thinking decision support tool. It relies, as much as possible, on the best available evidence to develop the standards. We expect that these objective standards will help our organizations use evidence to design and implement agriculture responses in emergencies. Our process for developing the SEADS standards includes the 5 steps that you see here. First, as you know, and likely the reason why you're here today, we conducted a global evidence review last year. Today, we've moved into phase 2 and are drafting the standards as we speak. In fact, I believe a few of our authors and our editor are on the webinar today. Once we finish drafting, towards the end of this year, you all, anyone, will have the chance to get involved during a global public consultation and regional simulation events. The global public consultation will be digital and accessible to anyone with access to the internet, using a platform that's modeled after Sphere's interactive handbook comment function, which you can actually already currently see on the Sphere website. The regional simulation events that we'll do will take place simultaneously to the public consultation in 6 regions around the globe, and we really hope that these will be in person. The simulations will test the use of the pilot handbook against realistic emergency scenarios at various points in the project cycle during design, implementation, and evaluation. Following these consultations, we'll finalize the handbook and publish the standards. So here is a sneak peek of the SEADS handbook outline as it stands today. It will have 5 introductory chapters and 3 technical chapters. The 3 technical chapters include seed and seed systems, non-seed essential inputs, tools, and equipment, and agriculture-related infrastructure. All SEADS content will aim to harmonize with Sphere and with other standards in terms of principles, humanitarian core standard, and technical approaches, and make frequent cross-reference to other standards. Okay, so now we're getting to the good stuff, the reason you're here today. A quick reminder that you can download the learning brief that we've just published, as well as the evidence base from our website, which will provide the same detail that I'm going to present here. So what have we learned from doing our global evidence reviews? First, let me share that the goal of these reviews was to find evidence of impact on people's livelihoods, food security, or nutrition from emergency agriculture interventions in roughly the last 20 years. So between April and December of last year, we hired consultants to complete reviews on 7 different types of agriculture interventions. These interventions were identified by the SEADS steering group members and confirmed by a rapid survey of the main humanitarian donors at the beginning of the process to confirm that they were commonly used interventions. Reviews were completed on securing land access, agriculture production systems, agriculture knowledge, skills and ability transfer, infrastructure tools and machinery, pest and disease control, market systems, and seed systems. As consultants came on board, we provided a list of suggested databases and encouraged them to also use their own thematic networks and resources to find evidence. As many of you know, we also sent requests out through our e-list, asking you to send in evidence that you had of impact, which you did, and thank you for those contributions. As consultants identified potential pieces of evidence, they were reviewed against this checklist. So the checklist was based on DFID, now FCDO, and USAID evaluation guidelines. It was also based on experiences with developing the evidence database from LEGS between 2006 and 2019, and commonly used criteria for the peer review of scientific journal papers. So the checklist 12 indicators provide considerable scope for evaluations of emergency agriculture interventions. As you will see in our evidence database, if you download it from the website, evaluations that use mixed methods, qualitative methods, or participatory methods could be categorized as moderate or strong evidence. To be categorized as strong or moderate evidence, a document had to satisfy the 2 indicators you can see circled in yellow here. The livelihood context had to be clearly understood and described, and the livelihood impacts had to be measured and analyzed. The consultants' technical expertise and experience guided their use of the remaining checklist indicators to select documents that were relevant and appropriate to their intervention area. After the consultants finished their work, the SEADS steering group reviewed the consultants' categorization of moderate and strong documents by using the checklist to confirm the consultants' categorization. They also confirmed that the emergency context of the intervention fell within the scope of SEADS. If the emergency context was unclear, a document could not be considered moderate or strong evidence. Okay, so to summarize, reasons for excluding a document for the evidence base included the following. The intervention did not fall within the scope of SEADS. For example, projects addressing food insecurity in a non-emergency context were excluded. The emergency context that the intervention was intended to respond to was unclear. For example, if the project title included the word emergency, but the document did not include the word emergency or even a description of the emergency context, it was excluded. The achievements of the intervention lacked any discussion of livelihood impacts. For example, an evaluation that focused on delivery of inputs, seeds or tools, but did not assess how these inputs may have affected, at a minimum, for example, yields or surface area planted, it was also excluded. So the results of our reviews indicate that there is limited evidence on the livelihood impacts of emergency agriculture interventions. More than 250 documents were initially selected as relevant to SEADS by the consultants. After the complete review process, 2 of these were found to be strong evidence of livelihoods impact from emergency agriculture interventions. 1 was in securing land access and 1 in infrastructure. 26 were found to be moderate, and 140 weak. We have now posted, as I mentioned, the evidence database on our website with links to all the documents that are publicly available, which is most of them. The database contains a list of moderate and strong evidence, and you will notice that we now have more than 26 moderate pieces of evidence. That's because you've continued to send us new evidence and we've continued to review it. New documents that come in are reviewed by the steering group using the same checklist and process just described. And we'll continue to receive and review evidence periodically, passing on any relevant documents, whether they're weak, moderate, or strong, to the chapter leads for drafting. So, to be very clear, the review confirmed what we already know, which is that this community has done a huge amount of work over the decades to support farmers and their families, producers in general, any kind of producer, and their families before, during, and after a crisis. This work was not for naught. However, current documentation is insufficient to know if emergency agriculture interventions have an impact on people's livelihoods. All right, so let's talk about why the documentation of evidence is so weak. Through our evidence reviews, there were 7 main reasons documents could not be classified as moderate or strong. First, the evidence lacked a clear emergency context. A substantial number of documents that we received described projects as emergency or humanitarian, but were relatively lengthy projects targeting people in areas affected by chronic food insecurity. So projects addressing food insecurity in a vaguely emergency context were categorized as weak. And remember, as what I just said, that projects addressing food insecurity in a decidedly non-emergency context were actually excluded from the evidence database. Second, many documents were categorized as weak because they focused evaluation measurements on the delivery of agriculture inputs, such as seeds and tools, rather than outputs or impacts. For example, an evaluation might report that an intervention delivered seed to a certain number of households. If it went on to describe how the receipt of this seed translated into production gains, but did not describe how these production gains translated into household food consumption, income from crop sales, or use of income from crop sales, for example, it was categorized as weak. And again, a reminder that if an evaluation did not assess production gains from delivery of inputs at all, so did not mention yields or surface area planted or any increase in improvement in production, it was excluded from the database. So evidence was also categorized as weak because impact timing did not align with project timing. In some projects, we know livelihoods or food security impacts will occur months after the end of a project. Depending on the local agriculture production cycle, documents assumed effects on crop yields or related benefits post-project rather than measuring them. Documents that assumed this post-project impact were qualified as weak. Also, we found that evaluation often described impacts on households without distinguishing between different interventions. For example, many agriculture projects use multiple types of assistance. Seeds and tools might be combined with pest control or farmer training. But for our project, ideally, for SEADS, ideally, as the set of evidence-based standards, we need to know the relative impact of the different interventions, and ideally, again, the relative benefit cost. In many documents, it was impossible for the reviewers to separate the interventions to understand which interventions contributed to the impact. If reviewers couldn't separate the interventions to understand which ones contributed to the impact, the document was qualified as weak. Another reason evidence was weak is that it was often difficult to assess the technical plausibility of inputs leading to impacts. In many cases, the description and justification for inputs was too brief. For example, the reason for providing a specific amount of seed or a voucher with a specific value was often unclear. It was also unclear how these amounts or values relate to local farming practices in areas of cultivation, and areas of land cultivated. Similarly, expected impacts were poorly defined. If an intervention aimed to increase incomes from the sale of agriculture produce, evidence often lacked the target increase in income and how relevant this target was to household economies. Even if a document described that an intervention resulted in households' incomes increasing, it could be qualified as weak evidence due to the lack of information related to the relevance of this increase. Strong evidence was lacking because evaluation focused often on production and not on impact of improved production. Many interventions aimed to increase agriculture production, but those that measured production gains often assumed that those gains automatically translated into livelihoods, food security, or nutrition benefits. Those documents showing impacts to production with unclear linkages to livelihoods, food security, or nutrition could not be rated as strong evidence. Finally, moderate and strong evidence was limited because baseline data on production was absent. Many documents did not have baseline figures for agriculture production. If there is no baseline production value, rational targets for production cannot be set relative to the type and quantity of project inputs. Therefore, impacts, or even outputs, cannot be measured. So, we have 168 pieces of evidence to use in the drafting of the first edition of SEADS. Plus, we have more that has been collected since the evidence reviews finished in December. And we have some clarity around why evidence is so weak. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jan to start the panel discussion.
Thanks very much, Racy. Now I'm going to move on to our panelists, Themba, Howard, and Juliet. I have two sets of questions for each of you. The first set of questions I'd like to ask each of you is, number one, what are your feelings and thoughts on the limited evidence? And two, what are the core reasons why there is limited evidence? Let's start first with Themba, then Howard, and finally Juliet. Themba?
Thank you. My thoughts and my feelings about this, having weak evidence will affect the applicability of the standards in some emergency contexts. Evidence from different contexts, rapid onset emergencies, complex emergencies, would have been helpful in ensuring that practitioners from different contexts find all the standards relevant and applicable in their work. Also, from a practitioner's point of view, it means that it will be challenging to come up with adequate and universal guidance for some sections of the standards, especially those that are outside the regular activities that we do, such as input distribution or trainings. Also, my feeling about having limited evidence means that us as practitioners, for example, and program designers, should start focusing more on the impact we want to achieve when designing the project, and ask ourselves how much of this investment will generate the required impact, and ensure that the investments are followed by proper result measurement. This means also investing in more robust M&E systems, including having good baselines. This will later help when we are doing evaluations. We can now compare information that we have collected at the evaluation stage, compare with a strong baseline. That way, we are sure that our results will be meaningful. Now, how has this happened? The reasons are many. One of the main reasons I see is that many emergency projects are short-term, and then evaluations are done during the project closeout stage. And then this results in the evaluation assessing the projects assessed using lower level indicators, such as output indicators, as opposed to outcome indicators. You usually require more time for agricultural projects to measure impact. And in many cases, that time is not available, and the measurement is done immediately after the action. One possibility is also the lack of standards in measuring impact of such projects. which means that different actors use different approaches, and then you produce different set of results. Also, another contributing factor is that in many complex humanitarian emergencies, a lot of challenges come into play during implementation, reducing the impact of the project. And then when you come to do your evaluation, you find that you have not achieved what you really wanted to achieve. This includes things like insecurity, access, economic collapse, devaluation, inflation. All these affected the impact of the project. And at the end, the project will be strong on immediate deliverables, but weak on impact when you do your measurement at the end of the mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Themba. Howard?
Great. Thanks, Themba, and also for those points that you've made on those reasons. I thought they were really, really useful. I guess, well, actually, first, thanks for inviting UK Gov onto this panel. It's great to be here. I think really based on kind of my experience working with FCDO, both on program design and actually now working in research and evidence. And I think particularly it might just be some of the areas I've been working on. So resilience, DRR, protracted crisis. The evidence on what's effective and why is often lacking in a number of areas. And particularly if we involved economists looking at cost effectiveness in these analysis, it actually becomes an even stronger question of why isn't that information there? And I think to some degree, this is kind of reflecting the fact that unless there's a deliberate investment in the original proof of concept, you're going to run into these issues. So I'm kind of flagging there the kind of slightly different histories around social protection and cash over the last 10 to 15 years, where the body of evidence is still ongoing, obviously, but it's very strong. In this area, I think probably it's best to look at some of the reviews that we were doing while designing a business case in this area. So it's part of a program we now have up and running called Supporting Pastoralism and Agriculture in the Current Protracted Crisis. We ran a number of evidence reviews. We found gaps on the effectiveness of programs supporting the ag sector and on the resilience of pastoralist livelihoods. And although we found a long history of agencies supporting return to agriculture after emergencies, we found that the evidence was generally weak, and actually the conclusion was that there was a need for improved evidence on effectiveness and impact, and hence the business case to move forward in developing the program was signed off by ministers. In terms of the reasons for this, I mean, they're so complex, but I think, you know, as Themba's noted, we know that all agencies produce reports on completion of their programs per their internal guidelines, donor requirements, etc. And those can be quite varied, as we know. And also, as Themba's highlighted, the outputs are generally reported, but it's less common to get to outcomes and rarely on impacts. So there might be something around theory of change analysis here. Also, this point that Themba's raised on those challenges. We know that in the circumstances we're talking about, the reviews and evaluations are not always immediate priority. We know it's difficult to manage the programs, let alone bring additional skills or folks in to work on those areas at the beginning of the program. It can be difficult to access the knowledge and expertise unless it's readily available in the organization or through TA, or the embedded learning guidelines and standards are already there. And, you know, when you're setting up programs at the get-go, your level of knowledge of the area could be quite scant, and you don't have that much time to get moving. And then, of course, there's the issue that Themba's raised around general funding for monitoring, evaluation, learning, and how much of that you have. And then, of course, you know, as the situation changes, attention and resources go elsewhere. So, frankly, the results of the work really reflect what we found, particularly in this area recently. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you, Howard. Juliet.
Great, thank you very much. And yes, thank you for the opportunity to be engaged in this interesting conversation. Overall, I would say that the findings from this review broadly mirror what we tend to find in terms of evaluations when we look across the sector as a whole. Certainly, every time ALNAP has looked at evidence of impact as one of the DAC criteria, it's the weakest. Whilst we've seen the number of humanitarian evaluations being conducted increase significantly over the last 20 years, there's been an overall slower increase in the use of impact evaluation, presumably because they are complex and they're expensive and they're potentially not appropriate to all contexts and programs. I think it's worth being clear that this study, and it was emphasized in the review and the presentation, but this study is looking at evidence of impact, and we have to be clear that it isn't looking at the quality of the programming or of the quality of evidence more broadly, but only evidence of impact. And we know that quality of evidence is not a pass-fail issue, but is about appropriateness for purpose. So if we were to just look at the bottom line of this review with only 2 documents considered to be strong evidence, it would be easy to draw unfair conclusions, I think. Impact evaluations can be difficult to make fit with emergency programs, and both Temba and Howard have mentioned some of the practicalities of it, and I think I've seen it coming up in the Q&A as well. And there are many circumstances in which they will not be the appropriate tool to use, but they clearly have an important purpose. For example, in this exercise that SEADS are conducting. Perhaps an interesting question is, how can we increase the range of methodologies that are practical for emergency contexts and that are still able to contribute to our overall understanding of impact? And this is one of the reasons, for example, that the humanitarian evaluation community is talking a lot about contribution to impact instead, as there's a feeling it's a more pragmatic approach. In terms of the reasons for why there's limited evidence, a lot of them have been highlighted in this review, but broadly speaking, I see them fitting into 3 areas. The first is the practical realities of emergency projects and what is feasible and appropriate in those contexts. So Temba and Howard mentioned about timelines being critical, but also someone in the Q&A I think has mentioned about the point about bundling measurement of multiple interventions. If you've designed an integrated project, then you will want to measure the complementary outcomes of multiple intervention types. But that will not support a study like this one that SEADS have been conducting. So there's a mixed expectations of what we want the evidence to be able to do. The second is the extent to which basic good practices were followed. If there's no baseline, you will automatically be limited in your ability to measure impact. And the same goes for good monitoring data. We know these are important and are recognised as critical by agencies, yet, as this study shows, they're frequently not addressed, and we need to understand why. What is it that's inhibiting application of accepted good standards in M&E? And the third is the extent to which assumptions underpinning the project design are articulated and well-founded in the project design documentation. If we recognise that impact evaluations are challenging, then a contribution to impact approach may be more appropriate, but this relies on a clear articulation of these assumptions, which is then essential. Thanks, Jan.
That's great. Thanks very much, Juliet. Yeah, and from our side, our thoughts on this, the limited evidence was a bit surprising because there are so many projects globally. And all of us different stakeholders have been working in the sector for many, many years. But at the same time, it was also not surprising, sort of, the 2 sides of the coin, because, how many of us have really heard of evaluations taking place? Very rarely, let alone, evaluating interventions post-emergency. I think we all note, global best practice and commonly accepted historical ways of doing things, and even innovations, and wanting to use that as a way to promote better practice. I think it does bring us a new challenge to make sure that the work in the field is encouraging better M&E, as some of the other panelists have said, and as many of you are putting in the comments as well that we were able to read. Reasons why this is happening, I think we would agree with all of you and the other panelists, of course, as well, that time and timing is a big one. You know, many of the interventions that we're working in emergency settings are very, very short. And we don't do continuous and ongoing evaluations, you know, after the fact, for the most part. So that's one thing. And then, you know, many agencies and donors have funds for implementing, but very little funds are actually allocated specifically for, you know, above and beyond M&E requirements to explore medium and long-term impacts for these interventions. So I think those are, you know, some of the reasons. Now I'd like to move on to the second set of questions for each of our panelists. The first one is, what should the humanitarian community do about this? And what do you think your organization should do about it? Let's go in the same order again. So Themba, over to you.
Thank you. The humanitarian community should continue collecting more evidence which can be used to strengthen future versions of the standard. So more evidence will be required, and we should continue collecting this evidence. Also, the humanitarian community should ensure that there is more focus on learning and documentation, even during the emergency phases. I know that at times we tend to focus more on saving lives and ensuring that people you know, are able to go back to their fields and resume production. But we should also ensure at that point that we document impact and we do proper evaluation. And for my organization, I believe we should contribute to this evidence base by doing more impact studies in all the places where we are implementing activities similar to what the standards are focusing on. And we should also advocate for funding for impact studies, and also for flexibility to ensure that such studies can be done even when the project, you know, have ended, which is currently one of our challenges. We should also ensure that in future, when we implement agricultural projects, all of them have a strong impact evaluation component, so that we can continue contributing to this evidence base. Thank you.
Thank you, Themba. Howard?
Fantastic, Themba. Kind of in great agreement here. I think one of the kind of building on the last conversation is looking at, you know, why this has happened. You know, the priority setting, the timelines, funding availability. I mean, if we look at those as kind of system constraints, I guess it would be kind of useful to kind of unpack those a bit to make the system function. Kind of support, actually, Juliet's point on an increased attention on our assumptions, which kind of underpin these interventions and making them clearer from the get-go. With Themba, yeah, greater investment in monitoring, evaluation, learning, knowledge management to enable us to move forward, and an increase on focus, essentially, on what data do we have and how can we get this data, looking at our ability to actually deliver on this agenda. And I think Juliet was noting that, you know, we do have a range of methods developed by academics, agencies, practitioners, which are intended to be feasible, rapid, comparatively inexpensive, based on quantitative and qualitative methods. So, you know, from the work that we covered, and of course I'm not covering necessarily everything here, we seem to be kind of not really getting to the highly rigorous kind of RCT type work, or these intermediate methods, applying them sufficiently to get our lessons together. So there's clearly a lot more scope to do more to develop these approaches and fund and implement innovative methods for meeting the existing knowledge gaps. And then in terms of what we're doing in FCDO, again, agreeing on this point of an increased focus and investment in monitoring, evaluation and learning. I've mentioned the SPARK program previously. I mean, the reason we have the program is to kind of look at some of these issues. What we found on looking at our own programs on resilience and pastoralist communities was that generally they weren't focused on generating research to support effective action. There were some notable exceptions. So the BRACE program, which I think people might know, building resilience and adaptation to climate extremes and disasters, and Spark picks up some of the areas from that. And interestingly, on the Hunger Safety Net program in Kenya, which had a large cash component, to go back to a theme I mentioned earlier. So, you know, in terms of what Spark will do, I mean, it's aiming to develop evidence, broker and manage our knowledge to inform the design of our policies and programs. And it's very operationally focused, providing that kind of TA support to FCDO policy and program teams to make sure we know what evidence is available, what's missing, to build on that knowledge, and to help kind of inform investment and learning in future program design. So I know there's a kind of a gap between ideas and actually getting it into practice, but you know, we're hoping that Spark program will move us in that direction. Thanks, Jan.
Thanks very much, Howard. Juliet, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of what the humanitarian community should do about it, or could do about it, I think first off, every part of the sector needs to make sure that these basic good monitoring and evaluation practices are followed, and that the right incentives are in place to make that happen. So at this point again about baselines and monitoring data being essential components for establishing change. And of course, I'm delighted that both Temba and Howard have mentioned their institutional commitment to supporting improved monitoring evaluation practices, which is great. But, you know, we need to overcome whatever the inhibitors to these practices are, and that has to be a collective effort across the sector, I think. I think also we need to ensure that agencies are aware of the range of methodologies available. Again, Howard mentioned that, which is great. And that they are able to identify the methodology that will give them the level of confidence, the level of evidential confidence that they need for their purposes. Again, this idea of a kind of contribution to impact methodology may be more appropriate in emergency contexts, but then it will need to be applied with the degree of rigor to make sure that it derives the most useful results. And then I think coordination. So coordination is really important. The evaluation community have explored shared frameworks at different times. This is a good option if we want more precise answers to fewer questions, but you know, there have been mixed successes in agreeing such frameworks. But without a shared framework or shared understanding of frameworks, it's really difficult to aggregate findings and to come to conclusions collectively. ALNAP's experience is that multi-agency evaluations derive better results than single agencies ones. So we would advocate for greater coordination between agencies to pool resources and learning opportunities in order to generate a higher quality of evidence. And also the third point on coordination, which I think this review highlights really well, is across the sector, we need to all continue to be committed to sharing the evidence that we have and making it accessible to as broad a range of stakeholders in the sector as possible to make sure that the evidence that does exist is as well used as possible. In terms of what my organisation should be doing about it, well, ALNAP was created by the sector for the sector to enable and support and facilitate improved learning across the sector. And evaluative approaches are obviously a key learning tool, and part of our commitment is to share best practices in monitoring evaluation approaches and to bring together the ME community to share their experiences on what works and doesn't work, and to coordinate the production of guidance and toolkits to support M&E practitioners. We also, part of our role is to champion and promote the importance of evaluations and to increase awareness of the variety of methodologies that exist, the pros and cons of each, and to also share experiences of how they get applied in practice. And also we want to continue to promote more coordinated approaches to learning, both in facilitating the conversations between different actors, as well as increasing multi-agency evaluations, and to make the findings from evaluations as available to the sector as possible, for example, through our help library, which was one of the resources that was used in this review. Thanks, Jan.
Thanks very much, Juliet. From our side, I think we need to remind ourselves, as the humanitarian community, which of course we as a donor are part of, that a better understanding maybe of impact of emergency agricultural interventions on livelihoods doesn't only affect short-term outcomes of disaster responses, but can, obviously, if properly designed, increase resilience of affected populations and reduce the severity and associated humanitarian response needs of the next shock or emergency. Does that mean we need to maybe create custom indicators or budget for rapid evaluations at the end of activities? Develop communities of practice to encourage documenting evidence? I think some of what Juliet was mentioning there is somewhat similar with the coordination. And collaborate with other implementers to demonstrate impact or lack thereof. What are we at USAID going to do about this? Well, we have a long history of supporting impact studies across many sectors. And now with better knowledge, for example, from this one, of the gaps that we're finding in agriculture, it allows us and gives us an opportunity to work with you, our partners, to come up with better systems for tracking the collective results of this work that we're all engaged in. It's going to allow us to prioritize and focus operational research funds to be able to address the gaps and enhance our evidence base available so that we can have improved guidance for emergency agricultural interventions in the future. And we would encourage our co-donors and emergency agriculture implementers to engage in the SEADS project to improve its ability to collect impact evidence and to elevate the attention to agricultural interventions in emergencies. So that's it for my prepared questions. For the Q&A, I'm now going to turn over to Kathy from LEGS, who's going to moderate for us.
Thanks very much, Jan, and hello, everybody. Just to remind you, you can put questions, please, in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, which is where I'll be taking them from. We do have about 170 people on the call, and so there's a lot of questions, and so I'll encourage the panelists to try and make their answers reasonably concise as possible. And I'm going to start with a question for Howard, if that's okay. Howard, how do you think FCDO, how does FCDO organize evidence reviews to inform its work? And what happens when you move to the program design stage after those sort of reviews are done? Thank you.
Okay. Gosh, short answer. Very, very simplistic answer is actually we have a call down facility on knowledge, which all advisors can access. It's called Knowledge for Development. It's consortium. IDS kind of manage the contract. So you can go to them to get a quick overview of what evidence is available, what the key questions would be. Longer answer, which I won't go into, is the role of the Research and Evidence Division in essentially developing key areas of knowledge for the organization. And I kind of mentioned the cost effectiveness analysis part with our links to the economic team as well, actually. It's becoming quite a driver around areas that we're looking around evidence and informing what the organization has been terming best buys internally. I think we're on kind of moving to putting those out. And then, from an advisor at the country level, which is where I've been before, you're kind of using those resources to help you design your programs and business case, also working with partners on that. And once you get to that stage of clearance, then ideally, and I think that Jan's mentioned this, and I think resilience is a good area, probably also cash flows protection, where we've been doing this, is then building in learning evaluations clearly from the beginning of the programs to ensure that we develop that knowledge. I think I've covered all your points there, Kathy. I didn't write down the question, but I hope that's okay. And I hope I was short enough.
That's great. Thank you very much, Howard. I've got a question here for Juliet. I think which touches on some of the points, several questions that have been raised about how do you think this sort of process of reviewing evidence might change if we removed the requirement to have a livelihoods impact and just looked at delivery? And do you think that's a way forward, or does that get everybody off the hook, if you like, from looking at impact itself. Thanks, Julie.
Sorry, Kathy, could you repeat that question? I'm not sure I quite got it.
Sure. How do you think, for example, the number of documents that would qualify as having strong evidence of impact or strong evidence would change if you remove the requirement to have livelihood impact and looked at a slightly lower level requirement? And would that be appropriate under the circumstances?
So I think it's really interesting, and actually going through this and understanding this review raised a few of these sorts of questions for me as I was thinking about it. And quite a few of the comments that have come up in the Q&A relate to this as well. I think there was something around the parameters that SEADS put in place on their understanding of or definition of an emergency programme, put quite tight time limits around the considerations of the projects, which has a significant implication for what you would expect to see in terms of livelihood impacts. And that's what I was trying to say around perhaps using a theory of change-based methodology where you could articulate the assumptions around each of the causal links in your evaluative process and evidence those incrementally through the life of the project might be better approach than putting all your evaluative eggs in one livelihoods impact basket, which actually might not be as feasible. So that was kind of one of the questions that I came up with that I was going to pose back to SEADS one day when we get the opportunity to talk, I think.
That's great. Thank you very much, Juliet. And that actually flows very nicely to another question that's come up in the box about how we actually define an agriculture project within an emergency setting and how we distinguish that, and whether it would in fact be more appropriate to be talking about early recovery. There's a couple of questions on that. And I'd like to throw that one to Racy, if just from your point of view, if you've got any comments on that. Racy, thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. So how do we define an agriculture project in an emergency? Well, SEADS takes a similar approach to LEGS, which is a livelihoods approach, as we've been discussing. And so when we have tried to define what we mean by an agriculture intervention, we're looking at agriculture as a livelihood. What are the activities that people do within agriculture to have that have an impact on their livelihood? So we don't have a precise definition of what an agriculture intervention is, but as we've been going through the types of interventions that are most common, I mean, part of our definition also has to relate back to having a useful handbook. And so part of this conversation has been what do we currently call an agriculture intervention, and what is most common, and what do people need guidance on? And that was the list of 7 areas that we defined the review around the review. But in general, an agriculture intervention relates to production of food. And we have discussed, does processing of food, is the processing and value added piece part of agriculture? And we have, on that specifically, we've discussed that that if it is on-farm processing, there might be a role for it in SEADS. There might be a place for it in SEADS, but that the focus of an agriculture intervention for SEADS' purpose is activities that focus on production of food. Great,
thank you very much. Shifting the emphasis a little bit now, moving to a question for Temba. Temba, when evaluations show less than desirable impacts and get buried or not publicised, is there an internal review process that looks at any undesirable impacts or undesirable outcomes, any trends in that? So is there at least any internal learning when evaluations with unfavourable results aren't necessarily broadly publicised? Could you comment on that for us? Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, so evaluation is considered to be more of like an audit where management has to come up with responses. So management has to look at the report and prepare, an action plan on how to address the negative issues that were highlighted in the evaluation. So this ensures that nothing falls through the cracks, during this whole process. So management has to look at all this and ensure that the mistakes or these negative issues are avoided in future projects. So then it's more of a learning process. Then what can we learn from the previous project and improve in our next programming? So that way, I think then we avoid doing the same mistakes and having less impact in our future interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Themba. I've got a question here now for Jan from the donor perspective. There's several questions talking about funding and whether donors are willing to support this sort of the investment that's potentially needed to get this sort of evidence of impact, and actually some different points of view. One question asking about how can we best advocate to donors for this sort of investment, particularly in the context of many millions being spent on emergency response programs, and yet an apparent unwillingness to invest in later and after action studies, at least to find out what has happened afterwards. But on the other hand, there's another comment about the idea that throwing more money at monitoring and evaluation is a solution rather than making some more practical assumptions in order to get a reasonable understanding of impact without having to throw more money at it. So there's two sides of the 2 points of view coming through in the question. So I wonder if you could comment on that for us, Jan.
Sure. Yeah, as I noted earlier, from our side, USAID is interested, obviously, in monitoring and evaluating all our projects, regardless of which of the bureaus that is. Here at BHA, which is the merger of two legacy offices, OFDA and FFP, Food for Peace and the U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, we have always incorporated, a requirement for M&E, and that continues to be a strong focus for us. Internally, once we've merged, it became a priority within the organization to make sure that all the work that we're funding has a strong and robust M&E component, and we would encourage that going forward as well. So obviously there has to be funding specifically for that in the budgets that the partners are requesting from us. That's a requirement, and we include that as part of our budgeting process. Outside of looking specifically within the projects while they're being implemented, we do also fund operational research projects. LEGS, for example, has some, and we have many ongoing projects actually in the crop agriculture and irrigation, pest and pesticides subsectors, looking at some of these evidence gaps and research questions that we have identified ourselves and with the broader humanitarian community, and invest substantially every year in addressing those. So when those types of gaps come up and there are good ways of researching it, then yes, we as an organization are open to addressing those needs with applications.
Great, thank you. Since we do have another donor representative on the panel, I would like to just swing that question also on to Howard and see if you've got anything you'd like to add to what Jan had said in response to the question about investment or not, additional investment in this area. Thanks, Howard.
I think, I mean, I could actually just get out of this by saying what a fantastic answer that was from Jan. So, you know, there's not that much additional to add on my side. I thought that was an important point that Jan just made on operational research and making sure that we have those facilities and ensure that they build in. And then secondly, is the point also that Jan made is, you know, at the design process or the early days of designing programs is to give that steer around ensuring that you've got those capacities inbuilt into the program and making sure that those costs are clear and accounted for, and adding that value to the actual investment itself. And I would think actually, yeah, I mean, I've said it before, but other than kind of cash flows protection programs, the kind of resilience work, resilient to what? How do we measure what it's resilient to? You know, at one point we were in, oh, well, cost-effective programs would have to wait until we get a flood or a drought to really look at that. So, I mean, actually, that still holds to a large degree, but you can build in practices prior to those events on looking at your programming per se, to look at how they do some of the areas that have been discussed today, and some of the areas that the SEADS program has been looking at. Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks, Howard. Okay, moving on to another question for Juliet, if that's okay. Picking up the point about bundling, which has been appearing in the Q&A box from several people, and the fact that it's sometimes challenging to distinguish attribution in multifaceted projects. Have you got any comment on that? How do we focus on attribution when there's different aspects of a project all bundled together? Thank you.
Yeah, I think this really highlights a very real tension around you know, the purpose of these evaluative exercises and the purpose of these kind of documents that SEADS have pulled together. And we're always asking M&E approaches to answer every question we have, whether that's a program management one or an impact one or an allocation of resources one, or, you know, we actually sort of need these M&E processes to answer a massively wide variety of questions. And the reality is that they can't answer all of them. And so at some point, you know, the people responsible for the program delivery and the design of the M&E approaches will need to make their decision about what the purpose of the evaluative exercise is. And from a programming point of view, of course, if you're bought into and committed to, you know, bundled sets of interventions, you will be designing your evaluation to look at the overall impact of that overlaying of interventions. That's what you want to know. And the SEADS exercise is a very particular one, leading to lead to guidance on, you know, individual interventions. So it's not surprising that it doesn't fit. I think what this says to this again plays on this idea of greater coordination. We need a mix of these different approaches to be able to identify a whole multitude of questions. And you know, we need to work out which approach, how many of which approach do we need, and when do we need them, and how do we go about them? You know, that's why I guess donors you know, fund a range of research bodies as well as practical implementers. And the question is, if we pulled all of that evidence together, what would it tell us as a result of the whole question, I think. So I think it is a genuine tension, but what it means is that we need a range of approaches to answer a range of questions. And that's a little bit what my first point was around. I think the SEADS review is an excellent exercise, without a doubt. But I think if you were just to look at the bottom line of results around, you know, strong or weak evidence, it would be a slightly unfair representation, because a lot of that evidence wasn't generated in order to answer the question that SEADS were asking. So it's not a very satisfactory answer, but I do think it's, you know, within organizations, you see this tension around M&E systems as well. You know, are you looking to it to make management day-to-day decisions, or are you looking at it in order to evidence overall organizational impact? So you always have these tensions, and it's very difficult to resolve.
Thanks, Juliet. I'd like to come back to Racy now. There's some more people picking up again on the question of the indicator of livelihoods impact and whether this is the right level to pitch it. And would it possibly be useful to use SEADS as a guide to categorize the most common and accepted practice as a starting point? Is SEADS in a position to determine a sort of threshold for livelihoods impact that would be sort of practical and usable going forward? Racy.
Thanks, Kathy. I think the answer is decidedly yes. I mean, we are really excited about the opportunity to have a monitoring and evaluation chapter, which is a little bit different from legs, and to focus in that chapter on the really practical ways that we can continue to contribute to our understanding of whether these interventions are effective, impactful, you know, whether they do what we want them to do and say that they're going to do and pay for them to do. All right, so that we're very excited about that chapter, providing the opportunity to set, again, a minimum standard in a first edition, right? Legs has shown us that there's a great growth trajectory for learning along the process of, you know, learning from each edition and gathering additional evidence. But we do have a great opportunity with this chapter and with the core standards on M&E that thread throughout the standards to try to set some very practical, fundable, realistic, appropriate guidelines around M&E, including impact evaluation. So I do think that we are going to aspire to do that and work with our writers, our authors in our steering group to do that.
Great, thanks, Racy. Turning back to Themba, there's a question about localization and the challenges of engaging local NGOs as closely as possible in the process, both of developing SEADS and implementing emergency agriculture projects. Themba, maybe could you speak to that briefly from your point of view, both as a practitioner and a member of the SEADS steering group?
Yeah, so we are working closely with local partners in the development of the SEADS. One of our priorities to ensure that there is involvement of many of the local NGOs who are working in the agricultural sector in our places of operation. So through the local coordination mechanisms and through the clusters, we share information about how other agencies can be involved. We also share information about SEADS, what we are working on and what we want to achieve. So local NGOs can be involved. On the evidence side, there will be other activities also that will follow where these actors can participate right up to the time when we have the drafts that will be shared and reviewed. So this is one area where I think local agencies can work closely with us to ensure that they contribute to the development of the standards. Thank you.
Thanks, Themba. There's been quite a lot of discussion in the panel responses and in the Q&A about timing and building in evaluations and follow-up into programs maybe after a program has finished for a year later or something like that, because of the process of seasonality and production cycles that are involved. Jan, could you speak to that briefly and comment on that aspect for us? Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Kathy. Yeah, timing was one of the things I noted actually in one of my responses earlier. And it's of course, from the agriculture side, we realize that, for example, from BHA side, the 1-year funding cycle doesn't align very nicely with the agricultural cropping seasons in, well, any country really, unless the emergency were to fall specifically at a particular time. I think, though, that there are ways that can be addressed. One, it can be a standalone, I'll say, project afterwards, where there could be results looked at to see how things are doing, at a particular time frame after the initial sort of 1-year project or even 2-year project was implemented. But in many of the contexts that we are all working in now, we are there for many, many years, right? Like Ethiopia, South Sudan, Yemen, Syria, Venezuela. Those are going on for years and years and years and years. It's all of, it's the same donors, the same partners, same beneficiaries, often same locations. So, as we're looking at these sort of year-on-year projects and being able to look at, if we do a baseline for each year for 5 years, that will begin to develop a good overview of what's happening, because then you can at least look back and say, okay, from 2 years ago, we were doing these projects. Now what is our result? So I think there are ways that can be incorporated. I mean, speaking with our folks here at BHA, they even noted that there can be a lot of results that are noted even at the end of a project with in the same way that we do a baseline at the very beginning, we can do a quick rapid result one. So there, that's one way. They said that the year-on-year ones, or then just a separate outside project where it may be a particular partner wants to look at what multiple different partners have done in a particular area, not just their own work. I think building into a little bit of what Juliet had mentioned, not just focusing in each individual's response in a particular emergency, but looking at it at a much larger cross-agency or inter-agency evaluation. Over.
Okay, thanks very much, Jan. I've got another question here. It's difficult to get a coherent flow, so inevitably we're going backwards and forwards on some topics. But for Juliet, just picking up on the point you made in your earlier response to Jan's questions about you were very positive about multi-agency evaluations and that they have the potential to deliver stronger results. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about why you think that's the case? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can also just comment a little bit on the previous question as well. It really, I think what's really clear around this kind of timing issue is that a project funding structure is not conducive to quality learning. Short-term projects with short-term learning objectives will not give us the depth of evidence that we need to really know and understand the kind of implications of our interventions for the populations that we're aiming to assist, which, we need to protect the space. All of us need to protect the space for learning and to commit to enlarging that space for learning to make sure that we are making the best possible use of the resources that we have available to us when needs outstrip resources so much. So there was, I think, a comment in the Q&A or earlier or something as, understanding impact depends on longitudinal indicators. So if your project is finished in 9 or 12 months, actually, to what extent can the structuring of the sector and the funding within the sector enable us to revisit those interventions at a sufficient period of time later? And the reality is that multi-year flexible funding based on a program approach and program partnerships is better able to support learning within the sector than short-term emergency interventions that don't fit into a wider cycle of programming and funding expectations. So there's a kind of very practical, our project funding structure, if we allow it, will squash the space for learning and will inhibit our ability to learn and improve as a sector. In terms of multi-agency evaluations, yeah, so it's quite a consistent finding within ALNAP that multi-agency evaluations tend to deliver stronger results, but I suppose my answer isn't very scientific in that I think part of it is to do with is to do with stronger buy-in. If a donor is funding a number of agencies to conduct a bigger piece of work, it will get more focus from each of the stakeholders because it's a more significant undertaking. There'll also be more funding available, which can be used potentially more economically by multiple agencies rather than this kind of, one evaluation fund, one project, one evaluation fund, one project structure. And I was very struck by one of the comments in the Q&A about, do we really need more money for M&E? Yes, of course, I would say yes. But at the same time, can we use the financing that's available more effectively and efficiently? Yes, I definitely think that we can. So I think multi-agency ones have stronger buy-in. They give us potential for a more economic use of the funding available. It enables us potentially to bring in better consultants who are more attracted to bigger bigger initiatives, more strategic initiatives. There can, of course, be a downside in terms of the amount of time that's spent in coordinating. More actors, more conversations about what we're trying to achieve, inevitably. But it also lends itself to developing more harmonized frameworks. I mentioned earlier that to be able to aggregate findings across multiple projects, you need some kind of a harmonized framework. And multi-agency evaluations will have to have that, which means the findings are more aggregatable. It also gives us access to a broader range of evidence, from a wider range of projects across which we can then triangulate from and from which we can draw conclusions. So I think for all those sorts of reasons, they're a really valuable opportunity for all stakeholders. But we need them to be more incentivized within the sector, because coordination is tiring and time consuming. But I really think that in these cases, it's worth it.
Right, thank you very much, Juliet. And just to make a comment out of a question that resonates with what you've just been saying about timing, somebody's commented that it's challenging to balance interventions less than 6 months. It's very difficult to provide evidence of livestock and livelihood and food security impact, and longer term ones give a little bit more scope. So there's further commenting on that in the chat, and someone else has put about some projects are even 3 months only, which is obviously very challenging. Just to switch the topics around a little bit and go back to challenging the donors, which we've been doing periodically in this call. Another one back to you, Jan. Would you be able to speak to the challenges you have internally regarding transparently reporting subpar achievements or negative impacts? I mean, we recognised in the presentations that lack of evidence of impact isn't necessarily a poor achievement. It just means that evidence is not available, has not been documented. But in some cases that will be the situation. Would you like to give us a few thoughts on that? Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I think there's a perception, in the community that poor performance shouldn't be reported, and especially to the donor, the one that's funding you. We don't want to report that up. We absolutely encourage reporting. That's not a problem at all. And we're very aware that situations and contexts often outside of anyone's control are the result of something that may come across as a poor performance. And so it's a way for us to learn, to better course correct, to improve for future. Internally, within BHA, I mean, we're refining and revising our M&E system, as many of the partners will know, through the application process that they engage us with. And we realize that some of the challenges to effective monitoring do include limited budgets. So there, there is an onus on us to be able to continue providing support for that, so that our partners and those implementing the work can monitor and evaluate. But no, there's not a problem with reporting poor results. Yes. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Jan. I think I've got 1 minute left before I have to close the question session. So there was a question on RTCs, and I wanted to see if we could throw that to Andy Catley, who's the chair of the SEADS group and also quietly sitting on the panel. Andy, there's a question about the implication from the SEADS document is that RTCs were the highest standard for impact evaluation, and linking to Juliet's comment on looking for contributions to impact, but the question raises ethical issues with conducting RTCs in emergency contexts. Can you comment on that very quickly, please? Thank you.
Yeah, Kathy, thanks. Yeah, I think it's perhaps a misperception. We certainly didn't prioritise RCTs. Probably the opposite. I think we tried to create a space for mixed methods, participatory methods, a whole range of different methodologies to be categorised as strong evidence. So there was certainly no prioritisation of RCTs, and from a personal level, yeah, I agree, they do raise or can raise important ethical concerns. Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks for being so brief. We are now out of time for the Q&A session. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to all of the questions that were raised, but thank you everyone for contributing. If you still have questions, the final slide will have the contact details of all the panelists. So you're welcome to contact them directly to follow up any of these issues. And with that, I'll hand back to Jan. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kathy. With a bit of remaining time, I wanted to ask Racy to tell us a bit more about how SEADS is using the evidence that they do have in filling the gaps to produce a handbook of standards for the agricultural interventions in emergency settings. Racy?
Thanks, Jan. So you guys have asked incredible questions, and we're going to continue to ask ourselves a lot of these questions as we continue the development process of the first edition of SEADS. What can we do about the lack of evidence? And as a set of evidence, we are aspiring to be a set of standards that is evidence-based. And we would prefer not to base our minimum standards. Keep in mind that these are minimum standards, not aspirational standards. There are standards that are the bare minimum that we think should be done. And we would prefer not to base these standards on assumptions. But our community has clearly expressed that we need these standards, and we need them as soon as possible, that they will be helpful, even if the evidence base that we're working from is somewhat weak. We can't wait to write these standards until evidence is available. So in the first edition of SEADS, we will address the evidence gaps in a number of different ways. So outlining the risks of using interventions based on assumed benefits. We will have a full chapter dedicated to monitoring and evaluation, including impact evaluation, as I mentioned earlier. We will value practitioner experience through our field team, through public consultations, regional simulations. Many of our authors are also working with teams of their colleagues, including as many as we can in this initial drafting stage. And of course, we'll continue to search for evidence. So throughout the process of developing a first edition of SEADS and after it's published, we will advocate for improvements in impact evaluation, including strengthened commitments to understanding impacts, we'll advocate for new funding and programming to be guided by evidence, and we'll advocate for investments in evidence-based learning and programming in emergencies. Of course, always keeping in mind in our advocacy the desire to be practical and understanding the context of implementation in emergencies. So I mentioned this earlier in response to one of the questions, but we really see a great opportunity in this first edition of SEADS to improve agriculture programming in emergencies through improved impact evaluation and through the tracking, as Juliet mentioned, the tracking of that impact at each stage of the theory of change. We have an opportunity to do that with SEADS. We are very excited about the opportunities that the new chapter on monitoring and evaluation in the core standards provide. And we also really look forward to your feedback during the public consultations on the draft version. You will have the opportunity to make direct feedback on the content of the handbook. So we look forward to your feedback on that. And I very much look forward to working with all of you as we move forward and try to tackle this challenging problem with, a first step, a first edition. Let's get a set of minimum standards out there and see how we can improve from there. So thank you, Jan. Back to you.
That's great. Thanks so much, Racy. And I did want to just give a huge thank you to our panelists, Juliet, Themba, and Howard, and of course to Kathy for jumping in to handle all of your great questions. I'm really sorry that we didn't get to answer all of the questions. There were so many, with so many folks. I would encourage you to follow up with any of the panelists or myself to continue the conversation. You should be able to see our contact information here so that you can reach out to all of us. I must say it was really thrilling to see such engagement both in the chat and the Q&A, and I'm hopeful that that will continue after this webinar, and even once the SEADS booklet, handbook comes online. I would encourage you to continue the discussion. It seems there's definite consensus among donors, implementers, and even the researchers that are here that better M&E and evidence of impact is important for all of our work. Coordination and sharing the results is also important, even if the results seem to be not what we had hoped for. And I think it will provide us a dedicated focus and funding on being able to record the results of our work so that we can move forward to continue helping the smallholder farmers that are so affected in the different emergencies that we deal with. We will be sharing the recording at the end of the event with all of those that registered. That will be coming out in the coming days. And please do share it with all your colleagues and folks in your agencies. Thank you all so much for engaging in this important conversation with us today. And this concludes our webinar. Cheerio.